I've been here a few days and I've met a lot of my fellow short story writers, and it's an incredible, experience to sort of not just get to know them and talk to other writers, but listen to them talk about their work. I'm still pondering Claire Keegan's comments, and this is really important to sustain this festival and to keep it going, because there's not another festival in Ireland that's dedicated to the short story, and Ireland is really one country. It put Russia as the other country that basically invented the modern short story form. We did a little bit, but they did most of the work. And so I'm going to read. I'm going to try not to read too long. I hesitate to not read a whole story because I feel like there's a lot that goes on in the story, obviously. But luckily, this story is available. It came out yesterday. It's available online for free for a while. So after the reading or later or whenever, if you want to go and read it, you can. It's at Harper's Magazine, and it's, well, I'll read it. I'll read you the story, and you can look it up. It's called Fist Fight, Sacramento, August 1950. The fight began in a tavern called the All-Star on the outskirts of Sacramento, when a young man named James Sutter leaned over and said, vaguely as if to no one in particular, "Man, do I fucking hate Okies." And a young man named Frankie Bruguera responded by lifting a fist to his chin and nodding his head slightly in the direction of the door, a gesture that said, "Step outside." Sutter in turn reached up with his closed fist and gently touched a knuckle to his own chin. The girls loved Sutter's chin, square and dimpled in the center. That much was for sure. The girls loved the authority of his movements, the way he stepped in his expensive boots. They admired his ease, the way his tailored cowpoke gear rested on his strong shoulders. Bruguera was short and husky, with thick rounded shoulders, a shock of curly hair, and a broad face weathered from the sun. He moved with a slight hobble as if his legs were bowed around an imaginary saddle. His heavy arms swayed loosely at his sides as he walked down the back hallway through the smell of sawdust and urinal cakes. Kicking the back door open, aware of his cheap knockoff boots, inherited from his big brother, he felt, stepping into the warm air, a deeper inheritance that came from countless barn loft fights with Cal, fighting until the two of them began to laugh, and then his brother released his grasp, stood over him, gave him tips on technique, always ending by saying, "Don't forget, kid, if you can't get him honest, get him with some kind of sucker, because to lose a fight is to lose a fight, and to win one is to win one." Meanwhile, Sutter went out through the front door, gathering a few spectators, mostly friends, strutting lightly with anticipation. He had been trained to fight by the family handyman named Rodney, whip-thin, dressed in overalls, who would put down his wrench or a rake or a paintbrush to offer a few tips, saying, "Dip low with the shoulder and round yourself over the punch, son, and get back as fast as you can. Focus your weight on the arch of your foot. As long as you're aware of your feet, even if you're not aware that you're aware, as long as you keep them in mind, you'll win." Rodney, who was taciturn and quiet as he moved about the house, fixing things, clipping the hedge, had fought Golden Gloves in Chicago before moving west. When he spoke about fighting, his words had an oracle quality. In the few seconds that it took Sutter to walk around to the back of the building where Bruguera was standing alone beneath the single street lamp, rolling his shoulders, in those few seconds, he had a keen sense that it had been bad form to even call Bruguera an Okie. After all, the Sutter line had Okie roots too. His great-grandfather had come from Tulsa, but the truth, and he really felt this rolling his own shoulders, was buried under recent good fortune. He was going to follow in his father's footsteps in the fall and attend Yale University. Anyway, Bruguera was mostly Basque or something like that, mixed blood that gave him curly hair, big shoulders, and a fireplug chest. There were about 15 kids behind Sutter, most of them from town. Behind Bruguera, a few ranch kids stared at the ground or out at the land behind the tavern. The town kids wore genuine silver belt buckles, plaid shirts with pearl snaps, and had hair barbered close to their clean necks. The ranch kids had faded jeans and t-shirts rolled tight around their biceps, and wind-blown hair. They watched as Sutter threw a few phantom punches and then stopped to take off his class ring and tucked it in his watch pocket. Bagheera put his fist in position, scrutinizing Sutter as he reached and touched his collar and then ran his fingers through his thick hair before putting his own fist up. The touch of the collar was the habitual move of a kid who wore a tie most of the time. It seemed to be saying, "Punch me first, you two-bit dirt hopper. Toss the first one at me and let's get this started so I can get home and take a nice, long, warm bath." The kids on Bagheera's side had watched him fight enough times to know that his tics, the way he moved after landing a punch and shuffled a few seconds with his arms straight down and his chest pushed forward before heading back in. He'd taken much bigger men. Speed came cheap in these parts, but his ability to take his time, to fight carefully, seemed to come not only from the brutality of his life, from the chores he did on the ranch, lugging water lines, working the fences, and all that livestock shit, corralling and branding and shoving, but also from the patience he had learned standing in the field with a flag, waiting for the duster plane, staking out the horizon, aware of the surrounding grid of acreage. Then, with his bandana around his mouth and the flag raised, he guided the first sweeps of pesticides, standing as far to the side as possible, but close enough to go back out to guide the next release. The sound of the plane fading to silence until it came back. As they watched Bagheera in that split-second tension before he threw his first punch, they saw the weight fall back on his heels as his arms began a forward motion, and then suddenly moved back again as he gave a warning to Sutter to avoid making a sucker punch. Then he threw a hard jab to Sutter's solar plexus. It was a good, clean punch. Sutter saw it coming, but it still connected. But some of the rich kids on Sutter's side had not seen that warning move, or the stepping back and scored it as a sucker punch. Just before the jab, in the tension, as Sutter stood with his hair fluffing in the breeze, it was possible, if you were looking carefully, to see that he was thinking about his place in the world in relation to how it might look to Bagheera. Time lives retrospectively inside a fight. It doesn't slow down. It tightens so that one move locates a relation to the move before it. The point of a fight like this was to reverse the flow of time, to reduce everything to effect and cause, and in doing so, to erase the everyday tedium of time. Everything that happened before the jab meant something. Everything after the jab gathered meaning in the moments before it was created. You must never disregard your place in this world in relation to the way folks see you, Sutter's father liked to say. We've had good luck along the way, but it was only luck. And to think of it as some God-given truth puts you in a dangerous position. To think you're in his good graces is to throw yourself off balance. And to be off balance is to open yourself up to the whims of those who have had a better footing in the truth. These words were usually spoken after dinner with the mask of port glinting in the candlelight. I've done some of my best speculating with a full-blown awareness that luck was the only thing involved. And in my awareness of this fact, and not some sense that everything I have here, his father swept his arms from one end of the dining room to the other, came out of providence of some sort, but more out of the way I've been able to corral my chances into a formidable stampede. He'd clear his throat and then say, you see, and then his thoughts would begin to unravel because he was a man who theorized and speculated beyond his abilities and often found what at first seemed to be profound and weighty thoughts breaking apart into something lacy and gauzy. Sutter held his arms up in his feet and kept his mind on his feet. The wind suddenly rose, bringing the smell of jasmine dust, gasoline fumes. In his ringing ear, he could hear the faint, absent-minded whistle that Rodney would make in the garage when he was working alone, concentrating on something, a saw cut or working a wrench into position, or when he was out trimming the box hedge along the back of the house. And he was hearing that sound as he unleashed the wild, flamboyant haymaker that had begun secretly as he was tumbling back, believing the force of Bagheera's arm cut loose, ambling in a wide arch. moved back to catch up with the rest of his torso. I just skipped a line. His fifth tightening, fingers curled tight, and then in what looked to those watching to be one fluid move as his arm moved on its own accord, landing his fist into the point of Bagheera's chin, sending him sprawling back into the arms of his friends who held him for a few seconds, saying, "Take his fucking head off, Bagheera. Do it for your brother, man. Do it." For a few seconds, as the two fighters stood and swayed. I just cut out sections here, so there was a silence that expressed a need for a much larger narrative. It wasn't enough, the air said, to simply fight over an Okie comment. It wasn't enough to have one more Sacramento fist fight between a wealthy town boy and a ranch boy. The air begged for a deeper significance. Then someone said, "Kick that fucking silver spoon out of his teeth, Bagheera." And on Sutter's side, somebody said, "Knock that clodhopper's jaw off clean as yokel clock," while the girls remained silent. There were 3 or 4 of them, and pitted the elegant beauty of Sutter's dimples and clean jaw against the rough, blunt complexity of Bagheera's face. With the exception of a girl named Sarah Breland, who worked the fountain at the Five and Dime in this town and talked with Bagheera once or twice, setting a milkshake in front of him, seeing in his eyes the sophisticated kindness that comes from hard toil. Knowing, too, talking to him, he spoke carefully, his words barely audible in the din of the store, the cheap of canaries in the pet section, the popcorn machine popping away, that he understood a certain type of quiet that came from living on the margins, not only of life, but of the town itself. For she lived in a house not far from his ranch, tending her sisters while her mother went to Sutter's house to clean. She had gone a number of times to the Sutter house to stand with her mother and watch as she worked the iron press, the starchy steam puffing as she pushed the lever down and made tight creases while her nimble fingers lifted and readjusted. Sarah caught Bagheera's eyes as it swayed over Sutter's shoulder and gave him a slight smile, as if to indicate that a secret might pass between them. Years later, she'd remembered the way he had nodded back at her once, quickly. She'd remember the taste of the dust in the air and the scent of juniper. She'd see the significance, the hugeness of that single glance, and the luck of having arrived at the tavern, hearing the shouts out back, and for some reason, she liked to think it was her deep sense of pity, of wanting to be there to care for those who were beaten, walking around to watch. She liked to think she had been looking for Bagheera, searching him out. But of course, that wasn't true. He was just one more ranch boy out of many. I'm going to skim here. See, there's a big fight. Sutter, Bagheera glances at this young woman, and then Bagheera loses it and starts punching the hell out of Sutter. And he uses what's called a pivot punch, which is illegal in boxing. It's rotating a certain way. He didn't know it was illegal. He didn't even know what it was called. He just started doing it. And they have this, first Bagheera gets his tooth knocked out in a very dramatic scene. So it's like tit for tat. Then the story leaps with a space break forward many years to this part, and I'll read this, a little bit of this part to give you an idea. A few years later in Arizona, sitting on the patio with a beer after working the day shift, watching Sarah lift the laundry to the line, a clothespin in her beautiful mouth, her thin freckled arms, her windblown hair, bleach blonde, Bagheera thought about the fight. Saw it filtered and bent through time, beginning with the summer romance it had inspired. Driving in his truck on back roads, stopping to take the old horse blanket out of the trunk, spreading it across the warm hood, laying back against the windshield to watch for shooting stars. The fight was filtered through that night a few weeks later as they lay hip to hip, hand in hand, and she began to talk, her voice husky, deep, arriving out of the depths of her lovely neck, saying, "Frankie, there's something I have to tell you about Sutter." And he said, yeah, go on. And she said, "You were kind of right about him making the moves on me when Mom was working at the house." Now I'm going to skip even more. I'm sorry. A few days after the fight, she had tried to tell him about Sutter. They were in the soda shop again, and she was again placing before him a tall chrome shaker of malted milk. Behind him, the smell of popcorn and cedar chips from the pet cages combined with a woody clump of customers and a sharper sense of men along the counter clicking their silverware to make her words inaudible. "What did you say?" he said. "I'll tell you later," she said. And then she went down to the counter to tend to another customer, holding her check pad up as she walked, attentive and sure. He watched her, shook his head, and went back to his milkshake. "I feel a vindication," he was saying out on the patio in Arizona, leaning back in his rusty lawn chair, bringing the beer to his lips. She was removing the handkerchief now from her hair, pulling it down around her neck, fingering the knot. Beyond her, on the edge of Tucson, the sunlight burned against the foothills. "When I kicked the shit out of that Sutter fellow, I felt it then. It's as if I knew you'd tell me that story you told me eventually," he said. He took another sip and watched as she shook her head softly to the side and then smoothed her dress against her hips, thrusting her belly out and patting it gently with the flat of her palm and turning to give her a profile view as he sipped his beer. "Forget it," he said, and he meant it. He wanted to bury that night in the past with all the other painful moments, standing in the field after the dusting plane, the spray, bitter and tar-like, the bandana around his mouth, mending the fences with his fingers bleeding, leaning into the crushing weight of livestock, his father's thick hands on the belt. "I was just thinking," he said, watching as she hung the bag with the pins. Suddenly they were simply two more married souls on the edge of a new development, two more sharing a moment together, relishing a sensation of glory, waiting for the first stars to appear. "Where'd you come up with a word like that?" she said. "A word like what?" he said, patting his own belly. "Vindication," she said, smiling. He loved the look on her face. He loved her face. He loved the down on her neck. "Honey, that look gets me through the day," he sometimes said. "When I'm folding boxes and loading pallets onto the truck, I think of that look. When I'm punching the clock, that's the smile that gets the card in the slot." "It just came to me. I was thinking things over," he said. She turned and looked beyond the yard, and they settled into a kind of silence that they would later in the marriage take for granted. Now the silence created a tension, a paradoxical sense of needing to speak and stay silent at the same time. But years later, after a move to Cleveland, they'd feel keenly that that kind of quiet was what love became when it hardened into history, one day after another passing behind them, because that shared sense of destiny that had begun the night during the fight would never leave. It was a secret they both liked to believe they shared in that first glance. A boy looking up, his face sweating and sheening and tight, and a girl looking on, pursing her lips in a way that she had seen in older girls, that went beyond her mother working in the Lee household or her own misery at the time. It was the secret of their future destiny. That's what they liked to believe. That's what they continued to believe for the rest of their lives. You weren't thinking about vindication when it was happening. You hit him hard, if I remember correctly, and then you hit him harder, and then he hit you a little bit harder, and you lost that tooth. And then you happened to be the one who hit him the hardest in the end," she said. "I fought dirty. Time's going to be the final judge, but I did fight dirty. I love you anyway," she said. "And I love you anyway," he said, feeling the cool patio stones on his bare feet. In Cleveland, he'd claim, "I knew it right then. I knew your name and that your mom worked for the Sutters. That put the fuel in me and made me want to kill that bastard. I guess I'd even go so far as to say I knew exactly what you were thinking somehow and had it all figured out." Much later, maybe in Detroit or their very last year together in Toledo, he'd remember it differently. He had looked at her and known intuitively that Sutter had tried some kind of funny business in the kitchen, or up in the maid's quarters, or down in the laundry room, shoving her back into a pile of dirty sheets and fondling her, reaching up and under her skirt while she tried to fight back, feeling the shame and the fear that came when a boy tried to do something with a girl, knowing that if she said anything, her mother would lose her job. In later years, he'd slipped that into the story when they talked it over. As he aged, it seemed too much to think that he had beaten Sutter close to death before he had learned that story. He had gone out at Sutter not out of a sense of dignity or honor, or even because of the slight about being an Okie, and only after the fight, when the parking lot cleared and somehow he got close enough, caught up with her, tapped her shoulder, his face still bloody, his eyes bruised, and said hello, leaning forward, trying to wink, but instead wincing, slightly confused somehow, because she had the clean, high forehead and hairdo of a rich girl, even though she wasn't. Maybe he knew that much, understood that she was the daughter of the kind of woman who would do the Sutter's laundry. Who else but someone like her would appear at the end of the fight in a lonely parking lot and lend a hand, touching his cut and saying it needed to be stitched, simply standing there without fear at the sight of his battered face. That's it. I cut a lot.
Which sort of makes my first question a bit meta in a way, which I was going to ask about how much you feel that the short story is an act of omission in terms of not just what to put in, but what to leave out, and not what to say, but not what to say. And obviously you were doing this in real time here in front of me. Short story, act of omission, not at all? Yes, totally.
I feel like I'm gonna. Did you see Claire Keegan? You know, I'm gonna just channel her. I think everything's an act of omission. No. You know, I think we all tend to try to find formulas, you know, that make sense of an incredibly complicated and lyrical thing. So, and I guess I'm not really being facetious when I say everything is an act of omission. I mean, you listen to a song and you hear 5 minutes of beat and lyrics, and you never hear the complete story, and you're satisfied. And with a poem, you just get a few lines and that's it. So I think I know what you're saying, though, more about how what's left, the iceberg theory, the Hemingway thing. Whatever works for him, whatever works.
Well, it's just occurred to me now as I say that every, with the great short stories, the ones which is why, and Claire mentioned Chekhov, obviously, is that every time you go back, you see something that you didn't see the first time, or the 6th time, or the 15th time. You spot something every time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of your own work, I also wanted to ask, because you mentioned this story, and it's interesting with all the writers tonight, we've had a lot of back and forth about what you were going to read and what, as the other writers. How important was it for you, because you have serially published with Harper's and with New Yorker and other places, in terms of your work being published in that way, how important is it to sort of work like that, as opposed to just going away for 5 years or 2 years or whatever long it takes and coming up with 12 or 15 stories and never showing them to anybody but an editor or maybe a first reader or nobody at all? And what is it like to sort of work in that consecutive way where you're sending work out? I think in Ireland it's been really interesting to see the platforms of Stingfly and Gorse and various people. They're a foothold for lots of new writers. What has been your experience?
Well, it's just gratifying. It feels good to have a story published and to get it out in the public eye, and then you don't feel as lonely as you did before it came out, and you feel like maybe you exist out there. So it's I think for a story writer, publication is that gratifying moment. What's strange is that for the first time ever, I've sort of gathered my stories together after procrastinating for like 5 years. Gathered them together, and it seemed like after they had all been published, it seemed for the first time just sort of easy to do that, to bring them together, and it didn't take any work. I just had to put them in this computer thing and put them in the right order, but I couldn't figure out the right order, so that was a problem.
In terms of, we were talking, because you were saying that you might read The Secret Goldfish, which is a great story, and you said that story came to you very quickly and then had a long revision, and then other stories take you years to get finished. What was the piece like that you just read, or is it completely different story to story? I know Kevin Barry, the writer who's been here many times, has said that the best stories come quickly, often inside a week, and that's probably horrifying for some writers to hear, maybe. But
yeah, I've never had a story come in quickly. I mean, I've written stories where I wrote the first draft quickly, and I usually do that anyway. But
how quick is quickly?
You know, as fast as I write. You know, just writing quickly. And with the Secret Goldfish, I remember I did have like a morning where I wrote it at my kitchen table. I wrote half of it, really kind of fast, and then I went to a bookstore and bought a book on philosophy, a little like guide to philosophy. Read one chapter on Heraclitus, is that how you say his name? And then I ran back home. I drove home quickly and wrote the rest of the story, but then it took like months of revision to fix, to get it to right. But this story that I just read, I wrote like 6-7 years ago. I had been reading Lolita for the second or third time, and then I just started writing. I wrote this story, and then I put it in a file, and it sat there for a long time, and then I finally got it out a few months ago and started fixing it. It's not some grand, pompous process. I don't do that to like sound like, wow, he holds stories for 7 months. I just didn't think it was good. But that's this story. Actually, another reason, Fist Fight, this story is based on a friend of mine, Frank Burgon. I changed it to Frankie Pagera. Frank Burgon is a really good friend of mine. He's in his 70s. He's a world-renowned expert on the West in literature. And he grew up on a ranch in California. And we're big, I hate to admit it, but we kind of like boxing. So we would go to boxing matches together. And Frank told me about growing up on the ranch and standing out in the field with the pesticides. And that was the seed that got me writing the story. But I didn't want to just write a fight story, so it ended up being about something else.
When I talked to writers about the short story, and again, we touched on it in the earlier event about where something starts, and writers, short story writers specifically, often say the same thing. They say image, they say voice, they say character, they say setting, they say tone. None of them say plot. And various short story writers have said to me that they think that the short story, that plot is something that the short story can ignore. How do you feel?
I mean, the word plot is really problematic.
When you've got 10 pages to write something, it's very problematic, I think.
I mean, a story, it's really the most natural form, and you don't sit at a bar and tell a novel. You know, and you don't, so it's really the physics of a story, to me at least, and this is just my thing. Every writer, when they're talking about like how it all works and this and that, they're just building a scaffolding around their work. And it's a way of like figuring out how they think, how to support their own work. You know, it's a very like, you know, when somebody says something very precise and grand about how it works, they're just talking to themselves about like how it works. I mean, for example, The Lonely Voice, Frank O'Connor, the whole thing about the submerged, and the part that he has a chapter on Hemingway where he attacks Hemingway, and he has another chapter. It's Catherine Mansfield where he likes Catherine Mansfield, and then he has you know, this theory. It's really him talking to himself about how he does what he does, and builds a structure around the things so that he can understand what he's doing. And it helps other people to understand how to do it, but he's really building a scaffolding around his own work, which I don't even know what the question was. I lost it. So the plot, I mean, to me, and this is my thing I was trying to say, is that a great story has a certain kind of physics to it that captures some essence of the human condition, and I know that's a very unfashionable term, that's obviously universal. And that in a story you only have the physics has to work right, and you only have a short amount of space. You have an infant infinity in front of the story, and you have an infinity behind it. So it's obviously a glimpse of something. And the reader knows that, if they're a good reader. And then you get this, what I feel it's like a pivot, this moment. For example, in Chekhov's story, Misery, which is a great little short story, it starts out with, the first opening line is like one word, which I love, because some writing teachers like, never write with more. I think or maybe it's two words, night. It was night, maybe it's night. The end of the story is, I forget the character's name, talking to his horse. He's a taxi dray driver, and he has lost his son. And at the beginning of the story, he's leaned over with snow on his back. It's cold in Moscow, and he has to still work. And he goes, and he picks up some fare, and they're obnoxious. They're drunk. They're obnoxious. And he says, my son died yesterday or something, and they just like, get going, move. So and that's, the pivot of the story is that he goes and talks to the horse. And there's a lot more to the story, but for me, and this is just again my feeling, it's the essence of it, touching that human condition. Now, I have to add a footnote that that's not always true. There's a lot of great stories that somehow they do it, but I don't know how they do it, and I can't explain it. Or their poetry, or there's something else.
We were talking about George Saunders earlier, and I interviewed George earlier this year, and much was being made of Lincoln in the Bardo, not least because it's on the Booker shortlist now. That it took him so long to get around to the novel, and to the point where he actually said people assumed he wrote one years ago and they just forgotten it. It took you quite a while to get to Hystopia. I mean, we're going back, you've been writing for like 3 decades, been published for 3 decades, probably writing for longer. Did you have some sort of resistance? George said that he did, and he said the idea was very long. He'd had it for a long time, and every time he tried to go back, he said he was convinced every time he went back to it that he just couldn't make this book work, and then he had a moment where it all came together. Yeah. Why did you hesitate with the novel for so long?
I didn't hesitate.
Yeah.
I wrote some big monstrosity that was like Look Homeward, Angel Part 2, the sequel. It was just huge. It was horrible. I had kids. I was at home with my kids as an at-home father for years. I tried again. It didn't feel right. And I finally did it. It's a really long story, and I'm not going to tell it. But my feeling is like, why? Like Chopin wrote the Nocturnals, right? Those incredible little songs. Nobody says like, why don't you write a symphony? What's wrong with you? There's something about it's clearly partially economic, but there's something about the idea that you write a story collection and that's just a prelude to a novel or a warm-up act. It's not, it's a completely different thing, and it's not the same thing, and so anyway, I just didn't write one, and I finally found a way to do it. It partially had to do with time. Finally getting a year off to just, it took me 10 years, so I took 1 year off to write a rough draft of this thing, and then I finally got another year off to really figure out what I was really doing.
I don't know how you feel about this topic, but the idea of writing in somewhat dark times, things that are going on in the US, is that something that you completely have to leave outside of yourself and your writing self in the writing room and away from the desk, or is there a process of osmosis that you can't actually stop that stuff getting in, and do you have to sort of be aware of it, address it or ignore it, or just not even engage with it in any way? It's hard not to, I guess. It's because everyone's talking about it and the news is so relentless.
Yeah, I feel when 9/11 happened, which killed my neighbor and a lot of people in my town died that morning, somebody, the BBC, or I don't know, not that I'm actually ever contacted by the BBC, it wasn't like, but somebody contacted me and said, what do you, something like, well, I don't know, like, will you ever write about 9/11? And I'm like, that's all I've ever written about. And I didn't mean it facetiously. I meant that, an apocalyptic event in your life is when your child has cancer, or when your dog dies, or when, I'm talking about dog you love, or when,
As opposed to when you hate.
I mean, that's the essence. It's not, that's the tragedy, is when these, and so 9/11 was a huge tragedy, and it did obviously infuse thinking in the way we think. And I've actually tried to write one 9/11 story recently, but it didn't work. But, you know, with Trump, there's just no, you know, it's such a blaring loud siren and loud clown show and continual noise. But I've always been surrounded by a lot of noise. I had two kids in the house, and there was but his noise is different. To use the word nuclear as if it's a tactical weapon, when all it is a device to mass murder people, and it could never solve any kind of tactical problem in any kind of war ever. And then suddenly they called the last hurricane a nuclear hurricane. I began to get really worried.
Do you think, though, that we did something on the book show a while ago, Will Self, and he was saying that he thinks of the novel as a sort of a type of national DNA, something that takes the temperature of a culture and a society. And I wonder, can a short story do that? And I ask because sometimes, again, you might want to write a novel about something that'll take you 5 years, but a short story can be written very quickly, very reactively, and be up online in a matter of a couple of weeks.
That's a good question. I mean, because I see that what I have always thought to myself when I write a story, and I was always behind these giant, big behemoth novelists. Like, I wasn't really close with him, but I knew David Foster Wallace, and I am friends with Jonathan Franzen is really my best friend. He's a totally misunderstood public figure, but he's a good guy. We're completely different. But, you know, I always felt like a little water skier behind these big giant boats, and I was just catching their waves. And my goal, and I think this is the goal of the story, is to write maybe one or two stories that are so, that do whatever they need to do. They're like a splinter under the fingernail of culture. The culture just can't get rid of that story. Like The Imp of the Perverse, which was, but not The Imp, but The Black Cat by Edgar Allan Poe, or Catherine Mansfield Garden Party, or, you know, whatever great story there is, you can't get rid of that stuff. You can't get rid of it because it does something. It sends out a signal.
You wanted to read something else, maybe because we're big on funerals over here. Maybe you might want to read this piece particularly before we throw it out to you for questions. So tell me a bit about this piece and why you wanted to read it.
Well, I just wanted to read another piece that had a different tone. Because I do whatever the story has to do, and sometimes I write in third person, and I write historical-based stories, and sometimes I write other forms. And also, it's the title of my collection, my new collection coming out. I guess I think it might be the title. And I just want to throw this at you. A test. It's a teaser. It's a test run. I'm gonna, just to save time. It's a note written on what this on a funeral, and because I began to think, what do I want for my funeral? Like, I think I better write it down. Dear Morrison, as instructed, I put down a few thoughts about the memorial service. I'll have this notarized later in the morning. The house is quiet. The river is catching dawn light. I've been up all night. As the mourners arrive, play Glenn Gould's version of Bach's French Suite No. 2 at a volume loud enough to mask the shuffling of feet and the scraping of chairs, and, if it happens to be spring, the sound of birds outside. If it's early fall and the windows are open, the dead leaf rustle. Include a note in the program, quote, on good days, William Kenner felt the glory of existence in the phrasing, in the arched fingers striking the keys. He spent way too much time imagining Glenn Gould on the shore of the lake, hands deep in his pockets, head bent forward, with the Canadian sky looming above him. He spent way too much time trying to connect Glenn Gould's idea of North with his own Michigan idea of North, those sudden midsummer chills that hit Petoskey. And the one night, in particular, when the pine cones froze off the trees and drummed on the tin porch roof outside his bedroom window. End quote. When everybody's seated, play Like a Rolling Stone. Please put a note in the program. Quote, when alive, Kenner spent too much time pondering Bob Dylan's lyrics and never did figure out who the mystery tramp might have been. Although he did often like to think the figure came out of the hinterlands, one more American psychopath, perhaps. And he knew that type from his own boyhood, having seen them come and go, taking his sister out at night, pulling up to the curb in the summer haze of the street lamp. End quote. Everyone should remain seated during the music portion of the program, including Don Philpott, who, if he's still alive, will be nervously pinching the flesh on his upper lip where, as a teenager, he had a mustache. He'll be fidgeting because, I like to imagine, he'll be thinking about the Newberg deal. He might even be thinking about the time the four of us went down to the Amish quilt auction in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and we got into the argument about the motion of the spotters. Philpott mentioned that the men doing the signaling were intuitively manipulating the invisible field of energy, those were his words exactly, that formed around any kind of interaction that might lead to a deal. If you were keen enough, he claimed, you could tweak this field to your own advantage in the bidding. Next, play the original version of Louis Armstrong's West End Blues, and then St. James Infirmary, 6 minutes, 31 seconds total, at which point, presumably, Philpott will break into one of his sweating fits, wiping his forehead with his handkerchief and adjusting his ass on the seat, sulky with shame. Place a note in the program the following, quote, Kenner sat on the board of the New York State Real Estate Ethics Committee and chaired the Committee for Real Improvement in Real Estate. He worked tirelessly for justice. On the other hand, if it's clear that I was killed by Sullivan, please substitute the following message. Kenner tangled with evil. Gangster. Sullivan, who in concert with his dear friend shafted him out of the land deal in Newburgh and proceeded to build the Highland Estates, yet another bedroom community of commuters who had to cross the bridge to catch the train to Beacon, where, when, if I'd had my way, they might have taken the ferry that Kenner, was well on the way to putting into service, having already at the time of the bid, through careful nursing of connections to the state, received all permits and plot certificates necessary to develop a high-speed Newburgh-Manhattan service. End quote. I ponder way too much not only the bedroom community that Philpott built, the cluster of nondescript buildings, the terraces with the unusually low railings, the jerk had a Newburgh building inspector in his pocket, but also the lives of those who lived in the units and commuted to Manhattan from upstate every day, rising at dawn, dressing quietly in the dark so as not to wake their wives or husbands, and then slogging across that miserable bridge to the train and the long ride down to the city, and then, hours later, returning home in the dark, except in the summer, when the glorious Hudson Valley, bathed in warm dusk, would mock their servitude. Whereas I, through financial finesse and my intuitive sense of the volume needed to project my ideas past the scratchy noise of real estate market, had found a way to spare the commuters such a fate. Just as Louis Armstrong, with his ability to play loud and in tune at the same time, was able to project through the limitations of the Victrola and then later mono AM radios filled with static, his horn threw itself in front of the background music, doing whatever it wanted to do, joyful and strong. When the Armstrong piece is over, please ask for a moment of silence. If Philpott is still alive and in attendance, with his sweat beading on his brow and his long legs jittering, he'll find this short pause unendurable. And he'll sense that Armstrong is mocking his inability to play the market honestly. I just want to get your tone.
Would you like to ask a question? Anybody at all? I know it's late and you're weary. Think on it, and I will ask them then. What can a short story do that the novel can't?
Well, you know, that's again going to like, what can the Rolling Stones do that Mozart couldn't do? I mean, it's like, well, that's not a fair answer, really. The novel is a different thing, you know. It's stories. Oh.
It's very late for this question.
I found writing a novel eventually a release, and it's an amazing form, obviously, and it's open. You live in a novel for a long time, and you carry it with you in a different way. I see why it's much more attractive, and you know, there's a reason why they sell more of them, because they are more entertaining over the long haul. And aesthetically, it's just a really hard question to answer. I don't know what any kind of art can really do.
Yeah.
That's, I sometimes say to my students, you don't go up to a Brancusi and say, you should have cut that. You should come in a little tighter at that angle, and maybe the wooden base is a little too short. Or you don't say about a Picasso, I think you should have put the blue guitar over there. At some point, art is just what it is if it works, and it's there, and it shouldn't be held up to that kind of, I'm off topic.
Well, tell me this then, as somebody who's been publishing short stories for a very long time, and somebody who teaches as well, have you noticed the form changing an awful lot? And again, I'm thinking of the time, there's a Conrad short story called Typhoon, I think, and it's 30,000 words. And obviously, it's very rare we get a short story of that length now. So what have you noticed in terms of, not necessarily what people are talking about, but the way that they're talking about it in the short story, in terms of the form and what they're doing with it? Have there been fashions? Has it come
sometimes
down?
the talk is ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's like the rebirth of the story or another rejuvenation. And when you really look at stories and you look at the history, I mean, come on. What's the overcoat? You've got stories that are, it's been doing weird stuff for a long time. It's a form that has been, it's a lot of stuff that you look at something and you say it's brand new, it's not.
Yeah.
It's, I don't think I answered your question.
No, I agree. Would anyone like to ask a question before we let you go? There's somebody up there.
If you could read one book.
I hope you went to every event at the festival and asked this. For the rest of your life, and only that book. One forever.
Oh. I don't know. I can't answer that, but I would, I can tell you books I'm going to reread. The Brothers Karamazov. I always reread Ulysses every now and then. It just, so it's more like, I guess it would be impossible to answer that question. Because it's just impossible. I don't know. I hope I'm never in that situation.
Any last questions before we go? Oh, that was like 3 people at once, including Claire, who's in the back row.
I'll go with Claire first.
Claire, you go first. You go first.
What Heraclitus did you read that sent you back to your desk?
What?
What in Heraclitus did you read that sent you back to your desk that time?
I don't know. I can't remember, except I used it in the story. It was because the story started out with a domestic scene of a fish, and then partway through the story, I went into the fish's mind and left the family behind. It was a divorce situation, and I think it allowed me to go right into the fish and stay there for the rest of the story. I didn't think it out, but I also felt like cheap and dirty because I don't know a lot of philosophy really. And so and the book was super thin. It was like a guide to the entire history of philosophy in 30 pages. And I think I even almost quoted the book. It was and it was like a moment where it's like, as Heraclitus says, and it was like so. I did that in another story. I was I couldn't figure something out, and I was reading the liner notes of some symphony, and I just stuck the liner notes in the story, and it was people were like, how do you know all this stuff?
There's somebody who's declare, is it yourself?
What is it that you enjoy about boxing?
That's a complicated question because I sort of have a horribly mixed relationship with it because I do understand it's a horrible sport. It's damaging. I read Joyce Carol Oates. I've gone and I've met Joyce Carol Oates and talked to her about boxing, but she wrote a book on boxing, one of the great books. I guess it's the feeling, it's sort of the primal nature of it, and I guess that's horrible, but I went to watch some professional boxers train for several weeks and got to know them, and they're actually a lot of them obviously are really smart, and not some of them, the ones that fought recently. Those 2 guys. But, so it just, it's one of those things I like, but I actually sort of feel bad about liking. I guess it's the primal nature of it. It feels like the world is so full of things that aren't primal, and it just feels, sometimes it feels good to watch two people hit each other really hard.
There was somebody over here who had their hand up. Was it yourself?
It was actually a very similar question. I think you've probably answered it. I was just going to ask about violence. Seems to, it's like a current in a lot of your stories.
It is.
What is it about violence that attracts you? But I think
Nothing.
you answered it.
I mean, I don't like violence. I grew up in a family that was hugely dysfunctional and violent. I have a sister who's mentally ill and has been subjected to a lot of violence. I was subjected to violence as a kid because I had a sister who was mentally ill. But that's not an explanation. You go where you have to go, and America, obviously, this is the cliche answer, America's a super violent country, and you can't get away from it. But then you get to the family level and you look at Irish literature and there you go. You know, the dad with the belt.
Yeah. Or the priest with the stick.
Or the priest with the stick, or the laundry, or the nun with the, whatever they carry.
Yeah, absolutely.